The arrest that should have never happened. It was a quiet Saturday morning, one of those crisp autumn days when the air smelled like freshly cut grass, and the sun filtered through the branches of trees with a golden warmth that felt almost apologetic for shining so brightly. The world was just waking up, stretching into the day after a long, hard week. For most people, it was a time to relax, to enjoy a bit of peace before the madness of the coming week. But for Drake Carter, it was just another exhausting morning. Drake had been up for over 24 hours, having spent the previous evening and night in the hospital. As a trauma surgeon, his job was demanding, often leaving him physically drained and mentally exhausted. The 30-year-old doctor was tall, lean, and carried himself with a quiet, unspoken confidence. He wasn't the loud, arrogant type, but there was something about him that made people take a second look, something that made them realize he wasn't just another person on the street. This morning, though, he didn't want attention. He wanted nothing more than to get home, kick off his shoes, and collapse into his bed. His white coat, still pristine despite the grueling 14-hour shift, hung on him like a badge of honor. His hands were steady despite the exhaustion that weighed down his body. He had spent the night stitching people back together, quite literally saving lives. And now, as the cool air rolled through his open car window, all he could think about was rest. Drake's beat-up sit-in, an old but reliable car he had affectionately called Betty, rumbled down Main Street, the engine sounding as if it had seen better days but still running strong. He had always preferred this car, practical, inexpensive, and low maintenance. It had character, or so he liked to tell himself, even though his friends would always joke about how it looked like it had survived a few accidents, and then some. As he made his way home, his mind drifted to the patients he had treated over the past few days. The young woman who had survived a car crash, the elderly man who had suffered a stroke, the kid with a broken arm. Each of them had left an impact on him, but none of them would ever know how much he had invested in their recovery. He didn't do it for the recognition. He did it because it was his calling. Helping people was in his blood. That's when it happened. The sudden, jarring sound of a police siren shattered his thoughts. Drake sighed deeply, muttering under his breath. "Here we go," he said, already preparing himself for the usual routine. He had been stopped by the police more times than he cared to admit, and it was always the same. A quick exchange of words, a few insults, and then he'd be on his way. But today felt different. Something in the air told him that this stop was going to be more than just another routine traffic stop. He pulled over to the side of the road, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror as two officers stepped out of the cruiser. The first officer was a burly, blond giant, walking with the swagger of someone who believed the world revolved around him. His name tag read Travis, and the smug look on his face told Drake everything he needed to know about the kind of person this officer was. The second officer, who hummed back slightly, was lankier, wiry, with a grin that felt more menacing than friendly. His name was Jimmy. As the tag on his chest indicated, Jimmy circled around the car, coming toward Drake's passenger side window with a predatory air. Travis was the first to speak, leaning down with one hand resting on his belt and the other casually on the door of the sit-in. "Hey, buddy, you got a taillight out," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern, as if the situation were some sort of joke. Drake handed over his license and registration without saying a word. His face was calm, unreadable. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with these situations was to stay composed, to keep his emotions in check, no matter how frustrating it was. But Travis wasn't having it. "So what's got you so quiet, huh?" the officer asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Big plans for the morning. Somewhere you shouldn't be." Travis leaned closer to the car, peering into the windows as if he were expecting to find something hidden, something that didn't belong. Jimmy, meanwhile, was circling the car, his eyes darting around, as if trying to figure out some angle, some reason to make this encounter last longer. Drake, still calm, kept his voice steady. "Just coming off a shift," he said, his words clipped. "I'm a doctor." There was a pause, the silence hanging in the air for a moment too long. It wasn't a moment of respect or understanding. It was a moment of disbelief, as if Travis couldn't quite fathom the idea that a man in a beat-up sit-in could actually be a doctor. Then came the snort. "A doctor?" Travis repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Driving this?" He gestured dismissively at the sit-in, as if it were some kind of joke. "Shouldn't you be rolling in one of those fancy SUVs or something? You know, one of those cars with, I don't know, more dignity." Jimmy snickered from the side, stepping up to join the conversation. "Maybe he's one of those back-alley doctors," he said, his grin widening. "Or maybe a celebrity TV doc. You know, the kind who show up on those reality shows, pretending to save lives." Drake didn't react. He had heard worse. He had seen worse. But there was something about the way these officers carried themselves, something about the way they spoke, like they already decided who he was before he had a chance to say anything. It wasn't just about the car or the taillight. It was about something deeper. It was about their assumptions, their prejudices, their need to put him in a box and make him fit their narrative. But Drake wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. Travis, however, wasn't done. The taunting tone in his voice shifted slightly, now laced with a hint of arrogance, as if he believed he was in control of the situation. "So, Doc," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "what kind of medicine do you practice? What's your big specialty? Let me guess, saving lives is something you do on TV, right? Or maybe you're just playing dress-up." Drake didn't flinch. He knew exactly what was happening here. They saw a black man, dressed in a doctor's coat, driving an old car, and they assumed the worst. They assumed he didn't belong in his position, assumed he wasn't the person he said he was. They assumed, and in doing so, they revealed more about themselves than they realized. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this wasn't just another routine stop. The tables were about to turn in a way they would never see coming, and the consequences of their actions would ripple out in a way none of them could have predicted. Drake wasn't just a doctor. He was also a son, a brother, a person with a life, with connections, and with a story that was far bigger than any stereotype they could impose upon him. And as the officers continued their mocking jabs, Drake silently prepared for the moment when the truth would come crashing down, when they would realize just how dangerously close they had come to destroying their own pride. It was only a matter of time. The unseen connections. The tension in the air hung thick, like the humidity before a storm. Drake sat motionless in his car, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The crisp morning sun filtered through the trees overhead, casting long shadows across the street, but it seemed almost out of place in this moment. There was something unsettling about the way the officers circled him, like predators sizing up their prey. The mocking tone of Travis's voice still lingered, but Drake wasn't concerned with their jabs. He had lived through worse. The real problem was what was about to unfold, something they hadn't even begun to anticipate. "You know," Jimmy said, his voice slithering through the air, "I bet you're one of those feel-good doctors, aren't you? The ones who talk a big game about saving lives, but can't even save themselves from a busted taillight." He leaned against the side of the car, crossing his arms as if it were all just a game to him. His words were laced with condescension, his smugness almost palpable. Drake kept his eyes ahead, his jaw clenched tightly, but he refused to engage. He knew what they wanted. They were hoping for a reaction, some sign of weakness, something they could latch onto to justify their actions. But Drake wasn't going to give them that. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle these situations was with composure, even when everything in him screamed to speak out, to defend himself. "Hey, Doc." Travis's voice cut through the silence again. He was leaning against the cruiser now, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the interaction. "Where exactly are you headed? You've got somewhere important to be. or just out here trying to pretend you're a big shot. It wasn't the first time Drake had dealt with this kind of disrespect. It wasn't the first time he had been judged by the color of his skin or his job or the car he drove. It wasn't even the first time a police officer had tried to make him feel small, to make him feel like he didn't belong. But something about this moment felt different. The way they circled him, the way they spoke to him. It wasn't just about a broken taillight or a traffic stop. This was about power, about control, about making sure that they, in their uniforms and their badges, were the ones who dictated the terms of this interaction. For a brief moment, Drake thought about how easy it would be to just give them the answers they wanted. He could tell them about the countless hours he spent at the hospital, how many lives he had saved, how many people had walked out of his operating room alive when they should have been dead. He could explain how many people, including those very officers, owed their health to doctors like him. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Nothing he said would change their perception of him. Nothing he said would change the fact that, to them, he wasn't a doctor. He was just another black man on the street, just another person to be sized up, to be put in their place. But the universe, it seemed, had a way of righting the balance when things felt too unfair. As the minutes stretched on, the tension only grew. Drake's thoughts wandered, but not to the frustration of the situation. Instead, his mind drifted back to his patients, back to his life in the hospital. He thought about Mrs. Jennings, an elderly woman who had come in 2 weeks ago after suffering a stroke. She had been scared, fragile, but Drake had worked tirelessly to help her regain her strength. He remembered the gratitude in her eyes when she was able to speak again, when she could hug her children. He thought about the little boy who had broken his arm during a soccer game, how Drake had comforted him, made him laugh, and reassured him that it would all be okay. These moments, these connections, were what made his work worth it. But as much as he thought of his patients, there was one thought that kept coming back to him. What if this was the day it all changed? Just as the silence between them seemed to grow unbearable, a new sound broke through the quiet. A car pulled up behind a cruiser, its engine purring in contrast to the standoff unfolding before it. Drake's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the car, but there was something about the way it pulled up that caught his attention. It wasn't flashy or ostentatious. It was a simple sit-in, but as it parked, the door opened, and out stepped someone Drake never thought he would see here, not in this moment. The officer who stepped out of the car wasn't wearing a uniform. He wasn't in the typical police gear or a patrolman's uniform. Instead, he was dressed in a suit, his posture impeccable, his demeanor calm and professional. Drake's first thought was that he must have been an off-duty officer, but as the man approached, a name began to form in Drake's mind. His instincts were right. The man was none other than David Miller, an old acquaintance. David wasn't just any police officer. He was the chief of police in the neighboring precinct. They had met several years ago when Drake had helped a colleague, an officer who had been injured on the job. It had been a long time since they had spoken, but David's presence was a strange comfort. And as he walked toward the scene, Drake couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Something told him that this moment, this unexpected appearance, was about to shift the course of events in a way no one could predict. David Miller's eyes locked onto Drake, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but then the officer's gaze flicked over to Travis and Jimmy, who had both stopped their banter to watch the newcomer. The air felt thick again, and Drake could almost sense the shift in the atmosphere. Whatever had been happening just moments ago, it was about to change. "Is there a problem here?" David's voice was calm but firm. His eyes surveyed the scene with an experienced gaze, taking in the two officers and the situation at hand. The respect that David commanded, even without raising his voice, was palpable. He wasn't just a police officer. He was someone who carried authority with grace, someone who had earned the respect of both his colleagues and the community. Travis and Jimmy looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. For a moment, they both seemed to hesitate, the smugness on their faces replaced with uncertainty. David's presence had disrupted the dynamic they had so confidently created, and they weren't sure what to make of it. This wasn't just another routine stop anymore. This wasn't just another chance for them to assert their dominance. Suddenly, it felt as though the ground had shifted beneath their feet. "Well, Chief," Travis began, his tone faltering slightly, "we were just, checking this guy out. He's driving a beat-up car, and we thought he might be up to something." He wasn't too forthcoming with information. David's eyes flicked over to Drake, his gaze searching, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow. He studied Drake for just a second longer than the usual officer might have. His expression softened, just slightly, but enough for Drake to notice. Then, without another word, David turned back to the two officers. "I think you're mistaken," David said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "This man is Dr. Drake Carter. He's one of the finest trauma surgeons in the city. You might want to reconsider how you're handling this situation." The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth that no one had expected. For a brief moment, there was a stunned silence as the two officers absorbed the reality of the situation. They had misjudged Drake, assumed things about him based on his car, his skin color, and the way he presented himself. They had assumed, and in doing so, they had made a grave mistake. The silence between them was deafening as the reality of their actions began to sink in. They had no idea just how close they had come to making an irreversible error, one that would not only have ruined their careers but also torn apart the fragile fabric of trust that existed between the police and the community. And as the truth began to unfold, one thing became clear: the tables had just turned, and they had no idea what was coming next. The weight of the mistake. David Miller's words hung in the air like a sudden, sharp gust of wind that caught everyone off guard. The two officers, Travis and Jimmy, stood frozen for a brief moment, their faces a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and disbelief. They had no idea who Drake Carter really was, and now that reality was staring them in the face, it felt like a punch to the gut. It was one thing to target someone who seemed like an easy mark, but it was another thing entirely when that person turned out to be someone with power, influence, and respect in the community. David's voice, calm and unwavering, cut through the tension. "You're mistaken," he repeated, a slight edge in his tone. "Dr. Drake Carter is a trauma surgeon at St. Michael's. He's saved more lives than you've probably ever had to care for, and I suggest you think very carefully about how you handle this situation." Travis and Jimmy exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the situation sinking in. They had been in this job long enough to know that mistakes happened, but this was monumental. They had crossed a line they could never uncross, and the realization hit them with the force of a freight train. They had underestimated Drake, made assumptions based on his appearance, and now they were caught in a web of their own making. For a moment, the silence that followed felt suffocating. No one spoke. The birds that had been chirping just moments ago seemed to have vanished, and the distant hum of the city felt muffled, as if the entire world had paused in anticipation of what would happen next. David, the chief of police, stepped closer to the car, his gaze still fixed on the two officers. His voice, though calm, carried an authority that none of them could ignore. "Travis, Jimmy," he said, using their first names, a subtle reminder that he was in charge. "You both have been trained to uphold the law, to serve and protect. But that doesn't give you the right to treat anyone like this, especially not someone who is serving the community in a way that far exceeds your own role. You need to step back, and you need to apologize." The words were like a slap to the face for the two officers. They had been in situations before where they were corrected or reprimanded, but this was different. This wasn't just a correction. This was an order. David's presence had completely shifted the power dynamic, and now they had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. Travis, still trying to save face, let out a nervous chuckle, but it lacked conviction. "Chief, we didn't." "Enough," David interrupted, his voice hardening. "There is no excuse for this. I don't care what you thought or what you assumed. You treated this man with disrespect based solely on your own biases, and that's not how we operate, not on my watch." Jimmy, who had been silent up until this point, seemed to shrink under the weight of the chief's words. His once smug expression now appeared sheepish, his eyes shifting uneasily from David to Drake. He had never imagined that a simple traffic stop could spiral into something like this, something that could potentially cost him his career. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that they had crossed a line that went beyond professional misconduct. They had violated a basic principle of humanity: respect. Drake remained silent through the exchange, his hand still resting on the steering wheel. He wasn't angry, not really. There was a part of him that was deeply disappointed, but he wasn't surprised. He had known for a long time that people would make assumptions about him based on how he looked, how he carried himself, and even the car he drove. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But today felt different. Today was about more than just being judged. It was about the opportunity to confront the biases that people didn't even know they had, to make them see the truth, not the story they have fabricated in their heads. Drake had always believed in the power of education and empathy. He had spent his entire career learning not just about medicine, but about people. He had seen patients from all walks of life: wealthy, poor, young, old, black, white, Hispanic, Asian. And through it all, he had learned that the only way to truly heal was to understand, to listen, and to treat others with the same respect you would want for yourself. But here, in this moment, the respect he had earned as a doctor, the lives he had saved, the lives he had touched, meant nothing to these officers. To them, he was just another black man in an old car, and that was all they needed to know. Now, though, there was an unexpected shift. David Miller, the chief of police, had stepped in, and he wasn't about to let this injustice slide. Drake didn't know David well. He had only interacted with him a few times in the past, when his work as a doctor had intersected with law enforcement. But in this moment, David was an ally, and that was something Drake hadn't expected. David's eyes flicked back to Drake, and for the first time since the situation had begun, he offered the slightest of nods. It was subtle, but it was enough to let Drake know that he was on his side, that he wasn't alone in this. Drake could see the look of shame on the officers' faces, but he wasn't sure if that would be enough to change their behavior, not without real accountability. "I'm sorry, sir," Travis muttered, his voice barely audible, as if the words tasted foreign in his mouth. He wasn't used to apologizing. It wasn't in his nature, and it certainly wasn't something he did often. But the weight of the situation was undeniable. He could feel the eyes of the chief, the judgment from his fellow officers, and the pressure of his own conscience bearing down on him. He wasn't going to win this one. Not today. Jimmy followed suit, though his apology was even more begrudging. "Yeah, man, sorry about that," he said, his words awkward, forced, and far from sincere. But Drake wasn't looking for their apology. He wasn't even looking for them to understand. What he wanted, what he needed, was for them to realize that their actions, their assumptions, had consequences, that people like him weren't just stereotypes. They weren't just characters in some made-up story. They were real. They were people. David watched the entire exchange, his expression unchanging. When he was certain that the officers had offered the bare minimum of acknowledgement, he spoke again, this time with a finality that left no room for further argument. "Dr. Carter, I want to thank you for your patience in this matter," David said, his eyes now fully focused on Drake. "I'll be filing a report on this incident. It will be reviewed, and there will be consequences for what happened here today. Rest assured, this will not be swept under the rug." Drake nodded, his heart heavy but relieved. The system wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was moments like this that reminded him why he did what he did. He was more than just a doctor. He was a part of a community, a part of a larger conversation about justice, fairness, and respect. As the two officers returned to their cruiser, still visibly shaken by what had just transpired, Drake couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet victory. He had won this round. But the fight for fairness, the fight for respect, was far from over. This was just one moment in a much larger story, and he was determined to make sure that it wouldn't be the last. David turned to him once more, his tone softer now. "If you need anything, Drake, don't hesitate to reach out. We can work together to ensure something like this never happens again." Drake nodded again, offering a small, appreciative smile. "I will, Chief, I will." And with that, the moment passed, but the implications would stay with both men and with everyone involved long after the cruiser drove away and the sounds of the street returned to normal. The balance had shifted, and Drake's life was about to take an unexpected turn. The fight for justice, for respect, had only just begun. The ripple effect, the silence that followed the departure of the officers, was thick with unresolved emotions. The low hum of traffic, the chirping of birds, the distant sound of a dog barking in the neighborhood. Everything seemed so ordinary, so mundane, and yet nothing felt normal. For a brief moment, Drake sat in his car, his hand still gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just transpired. The adrenaline that had surged through him during the encounter was slowly ebbing away, leaving behind a mix of exhaustion, anger, and a strange sense of disbelief. Drake had been stopped by the police countless times before. It wasn't something he talked about often, but it had become an unfortunate part of his reality. As a black man in America, he was all too familiar with the assumptions that people made about him based on his appearance, the way he dressed, and even the car he drove. But this was different. This wasn't just a random encounter with officers who didn't know him. This was an encounter with two officers who had actively chosen to treat him with disrespect, to belittle him and mock him, simply because of the color of his skin. They had seen the old car, the white coat, and immediately assumed that he didn't belong. They hadn't seen the man behind the car, the doctor who had saved lives, who had put in grueling hours in the emergency room to help strangers. They had reduced him to a stereotype, a faceless caricature of what they believed a black man should be. It was a painful reminder of the bias that still ran deep in society, even within the institutions that were supposed to protect and serve. And it wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race, their background, their status. It was about the countless others who had been stopped, questioned, and sometimes even humiliated, simply because they didn't fit the mold of what others thought they should be. It was about the injustice that simmered just beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any given moment. Drake had been fortunate. He had been in a position of power. He had the education, the reputation, the connections to ensure that the situation didn't spiral out of control. David Miller, the chief of police, had stepped in when he needed to, and the officers had backed down, realizing just how wrong they were. But not everyone had that luxury. Not everyone had the privilege of having their identity validated by someone in a position of power, someone who could immediately correct the wrong. The thought lingered in Drake's mind as he finally started his car again, the engine sputtering to life with a tired growl. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as the cruiser drove off into the distance, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a mixture of sadness and relief. He had won this small battle, but the war for justice, for respect, for equality, that was far from over. And he knew that the story didn't end here. Drake drove home in a haze, the familiar streets and landmarks blurring as his mind replayed the events over and over again. He thought about the officers, about their attitudes, their words, but more than anything, he thought about the potential consequences of their actions. What if David hadn't shown up? What if the officers had decided to take things further, to escalate the situation instead of diffusing it? Drake shuddered at the thought. He knew that there were people who weren't as lucky as him, who didn't have the means or the influence to fight back when things went wrong. And that realization made the weight of the situation even heavier. When Drake finally pulled into his driveway, He sat in his car for a few moments, his hand still gripping the steering wheel as he took in the quiet of the neighborhood. The world outside his car seemed peaceful, as though nothing had happened. But inside, he felt the storm of emotions brewing. He thought about his colleagues at the hospital, doctors and nurses who had worked alongside him to save lives. He thought about his patients, who trusted him to help them through some of the darkest moments of their lives. He thought about the community he served, and how every day he fought not just to heal bodies, but to build trust, to break down barriers, to prove that people were more than the labels that others put on them. Drake stepped out of the car, the familiar creak of the door sounding almost comforting in the stillness. His feet carried him up the steps to his front door, but before he could unlock it, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. The name flashing across it made his heart sink. It was his sister, Jasmine. Jasmine had always been the more outspoken one in the family, while Drake had always kept his emotions in check, preferring to stay calm and composed. Jasmine had never been afraid to speak her mind. She was fiercely protective of her family, and over the years, she had seen the injustices that her brother had faced firsthand. She had watched as he had been pulled over for routine checks, harassed for no reason other than the color of his skin, and treated like a criminal even when he had done nothing wrong. Jasmine had been there when Drake had come home late after a long shift, his face flushed with frustration from the latest encounter with the police. And every time, she had pushed him to speak out, to fight back, to make sure that people understood the kind of man he truly was. Drake answered the phone, his voice weary but calm. "Hey, Jasmine." "Drake, I saw what happened," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Drake replied, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. He was physically fine, yes, but emotionally, he wasn't so sure. It was just a routine stop. Nothing happened. Jasmine wasn't having it. "Routine? You know better than that. I saw the look on your face. You don't get treated like that. Not by anyone, and certainly not by the police. What the hell happened?" Drake leaned against the doorframe of his house, his mind racing as he thought about how to explain the situation. "I was stopped for a busted taillight," he said. "But it wasn't about the taillight. It was about the way they treated me. They made assumptions, Jasmine. They thought I was just some guy driving a beat-up car, but they didn't see me for who I am." Jasmine let out a sharp breath. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. They saw you as a stereotype, and they tried to make you fit into it. But you're not a stereotype, Drake. You're a doctor. You save lives every day. And those officers had no right to treat you like that." Drake rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache coming on. "I know, but I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to escalate things." "I get that," Jasmine said softly, "but you can't keep letting people get away with this. You can't keep swallowing your anger, your frustration, just to keep the peace. You have a voice, Drake, and today you used it. But this isn't over. It's not just about you. It's about everyone who has ever been treated like this, everyone who's ever been made to feel small because of their race, their background, or their circumstances." Drake's heart tightened as Jasmine's words hit home. She was right, of course. It wasn't just about him. It never had been. This was bigger than one man, one encounter. It was about a system, about a society that still saw people like him through a lens of suspicion, through a lens of prejudice. The ripple effect of that moment, the moment when he was unfairly targeted, had already begun. And it wasn't going to stop until change was made. "I know," Drake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to do next." "Start by telling your story, Drake," Jasmine urged. "Tell people what happened. Share it. Make them see you. Make them see us for who we really are. This isn't just your fight, it's everyone's. And it starts with you." Drake stood there for a long moment, the weight of Jasmine's words sinking in. It wasn't just about correcting one injustice. It was about standing up for something greater. It was about using his platform, his voice, to make a difference. As he hung up the phone and stepped into his house, he knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles. But if he could use his experience to spark a conversation, to make people see beyond the surface, then maybe, just maybe, he could make a real impact. He was no longer just a doctor. He was a man with a mission. And he wasn't going to stop until the world had no choice but to listen. The long road ahead. The weight of the conversation with Jasmine lingered long after the phone call ended. Drake sat in his living room, his gaze fixed on the window where the late afternoon sun filtered in, casting long golden rays across the room. The house felt unusually quiet, as if the world had paused in response to his thoughts. He could still hear the voice of his sister echoing in his mind, urging him to speak out, to share his story, to make a stand. In some ways, it felt like an obvious choice. He had been in medicine for years now, had worked tirelessly to save lives, to care for people from all walks of life, regardless of their race, their background, their circumstances. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the fight for justice and equality would be long and fraught with resistance. But for the first time, he felt a fire stirring within him, a sense of responsibility that went beyond his work in the hospital, beyond the hours spent in the operating room. This wasn't just about his life. This was about everyone who had ever faced discrimination, who had ever been reduced to a stereotype, who had been treated as less than because of the color of their skin. Drake had spent so many years trying to stay in the background, to avoid the spotlight, to focus on his patients and his work. It wasn't that he didn't care about the bigger issues. It was that he had always felt a sense of helplessness in the face of such deep-rooted problems. He was one man. What could he do to change a system that had existed for so long? But today, as he thought about the encounter with the police, he realized that silence was no longer an option. He couldn't sit back and wait for change to happen. Change didn't just happen. It had to be fought for, step by step, one action at a time. His mind began to race with possibilities. He thought about his colleagues in the hospital, the other doctors and nurses who worked side by side with him. He thought about the patients who came through the doors every day, many of them struggling with their own battles, facing hardships far beyond what they should have to endure. He thought about the young black men and women in the community who were treated as criminals before they even had a chance to prove themselves, who were forced to navigate a world that saw them as threats instead of individuals. But as much as Drake wanted to make a difference, there was also fear. Fear of retaliation, fear of being targeted even more than he already had been. Fear that speaking out would jeopardize everything he had worked for, the reputation he had built, the trust he had earned with his patients, and even his career. The medical field was already difficult enough to navigate as a black doctor. The weight of that fear settled on his chest, a heavy reminder of the risk that came with every decision he made. Drake leaned back against the couch, rubbing his face as he closed his eyes for a moment. He knew that if he didn't act now, the moment would pass and the frustration would fade, just like all the other times before. He couldn't let that happen. This time, it had to be different. He had to find a way to use his position, his voice, to make an impact, to challenge the systems that perpetuated injustice and inequality. He thought back to the conversation with David Miller, the chief of police. David had been firm in his response to the officer's behavior, but Drake knew that wasn't enough. It wasn't just about holding two officers accountable for a single interaction. It was about addressing the culture within law enforcement, the culture within society that allowed these assumptions and biases to persist without consequence. It was about changing the way people thought, the way they saw others, especially when it came to race. Drake's phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from one of his closest friends, Marcus, another doctor who worked with him at St. Michael's Hospital. "Hey man, I saw what happened today. You good?" the message read. Drake smiled faintly. Marcus had been one of the few people he had confided in about the struggles he faced as a black man in medicine. They had been friends for years, ever since they had gone through medical school together, and Marcus had always been a source of support when the weight of the world felt too heavy to carry. He quickly typed a response. "Yeah, I'm good. Just a long day. Thanks for checking in." But as soon as he sent the message, he knew it wasn't enough. The truth was, he wasn't just good. He was conflicted, uncertain, and scared. But Marcus knew him better than anyone, and if there was anyone who would understand the significance of what had happened, it was him. Marcus replied almost immediately, "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but if you need to talk, you know I'm here." The offer was a small but much-needed lifeline. Drake hadn't shared the full extent of his emotions with anyone yet. Not his family, not his friends, not even Jasmine. But maybe it was time to start opening up, to allow himself to be vulnerable, to lean on the people who cared about him. Maybe it was time to start thinking about how to turn this personal moment of injustice into a collective movement for change. Drake sighed and picked up his phone again, typing out a more detailed message to Marcus this time. "I'm fine physically, but I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened today. I'm wondering if it's time to speak up. Not just for me, but for everyone who's had to deal with this kind of thing. People need to hear what happened. They need to know how deep this stuff goes." The words felt strange coming from him, but they also felt right. This wasn't just about him telling his story. It was about raising awareness, about sparking a conversation that was long overdue. Marcus responded almost instantly. "Man, you're right. You've been through too much to keep quiet about it. People need to know, and they'll listen to you. You've got the platform, the credibility. Don't waste it." The words were a reassurance Drake didn't know he needed. Marcus was right. He did have a platform. He had a voice, and even though the road ahead would be uncertain and difficult, he realized that he couldn't keep hiding behind the walls he had built for himself. He had to take a stand. It wasn't just about this one encounter. It was about all the others like it that went unnoticed, all the others that were dismissed as just another routine stop or another misunderstanding. It was about changing the way people saw each other, about shifting the culture, about fighting for the kind of world where no one would ever have to face the humiliation and disrespect he had experienced that morning. The more he thought about it, the more he knew that speaking up was just the beginning. There were so many layers to this issue, so many facets of society, from law enforcement to the media, from the justice system to education, that perpetuated the same damaging stereotypes. It wasn't enough to call out the bad apples. It was about addressing the root causes, the systemic issues that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. Drake stood up and walked over to the window, his mind now racing with ideas, with possibilities. He didn't know exactly what form this fight would take, but he knew it had to start somewhere. He could use his story, use his experience, to shed light on the problem, to show people that these issues weren't abstract. They were real, and they had consequences. He made a decision then. He was going to take the first step. He was going to speak out, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been unjustly treated, for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever was. The long road ahead was uncertain, but it was a road he was ready to walk. A call to action. Drake's mind buzzed with thoughts and ideas as he paced back and forth in his living room, staring out the window every now and then. The quiet evening had been both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, he had time to reflect, to think about the ramifications of the decision he was about to make. On the other hand, every moment that passed seemed to heighten the pressure, making it all feel like a bigger leap than he was prepared to take. The conversation with Marcus earlier that evening had helped, but there was still so much uncertainty ahead. It felt like a choice between two roads. One was the familiar, the safe, the predictable. The other was the road less traveled, the one that had the potential to change his life, and the lives of others, for good. He didn't know which way was the right way, but he knew he couldn't stand still any longer. He had to make a decision. The thought of speaking out, of putting his story on the line for everyone to hear, was daunting. It wasn't just about sharing what had happened that morning. It wasn't just about the incident with the police or the way the officers had treated him based on nothing more than assumptions. It was about a much larger, deeper issue. He was about to open a door to a conversation that he knew wouldn't be easy. He would be exposing the raw, ugly truth about what it meant to be a black man in this society, what it meant to be judged before he even had a chance to speak. Drake sat down at his desk, pulling his laptop closer. He wasn't the most vocal person by nature, and certainly not one for grand speeches. But if he was going to make a difference, it had to start somewhere. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of how to begin. How could he explain something so personal, so profound, in a way that would reach people? How could he articulate the weight of the prejudice and injustice he had lived with for so long? He had to start with the truth. His truth. The idea of writing an op-ed came to him first, a simple, straightforward article that could capture the essence of what had happened, explaining the events of that day in a way that would resonate with a wide audience. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. It was a chance to speak out, to take the first step in what he knew would be a long and difficult journey. He typed the title, "When the Badge Meets the Doctor," a personal reflection on bias, justice, and change. Drake began typing, his fingers slowly finding a rhythm as the words poured out. It was a cathartic process, like finally lifting the weight from his shoulders. But with every word he wrote, he knew he was committing to something far bigger than himself. He wasn't just telling his story. He was starting a conversation, one that would need to be heard in every corner of the world. It was one of those mornings. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the air had that crisp, almost fragile feeling to it. I had just finished a 14-hour shift at the hospital, stitching up patients, saving lives, and trying to keep my own exhaustion at bay. All I wanted was to get home and sleep, to let the world outside fall away for a few hours. But then the sirens came. And just like that, my quiet, routine morning turned into something I would never forget. I was stopped by two officers, a routine traffic stop. They told me my taillight was out, but that was just the excuse. I was a black man in an old car, wearing a white coat that didn't seem to belong on someone like me. They asked me questions, not out of curiosity, but out of suspicion. They didn't know who I was, didn't know the lives I'd saved, the years of education, the sacrifices I'd made to get to where I was. No, to them, I was just another person to be judged, a stereotype to be mocked. They assumed I didn't belong. Drake paused for a moment, his fingers hovering above the keys. He thought about the officers, about how their assumptions had colored every interaction. He thought about David Miller, the chief of police, and the way he had stepped in to de-escalate the situation. He thought about what had happened afterward, the apology, the acknowledgement that things had gone wrong. But none of that was enough. The apology was just the beginning, not the end. What about the other black men and women who didn't have the privilege of a quick resolution, of a swift intervention? What about them? He continued typing, letting his thoughts flow freely. I could feel the sting of their words, their tone. "Shouldn't you be driving something fancier?" One of them asked, as if the car I drove was a reflection of my worth as a human being. They didn't see the doctor who had just spent hours trying to save a life. They didn't see me at all, really. They saw a stereotype, a criminal before I even opened my mouth. I've been in this field for years. I've saved lives. I've put people back together. I've been the one to give the news that nobody ever wants to hear. And yet, in a moment of supposed routine, I was reduced to nothing more than a black man in an old car. They couldn't see the person in front of them. They didn't care to. They saw what they wanted to see. And that's what's broken. Drake's heart began to race as he continued to write. The words were coming faster now, and for the first time, he felt like he was on the right track. He was telling his story, yes, but he was also sharing a universal truth. This was a problem bigger than just one man, one incident, one traffic stop. It was about systemic issues, about the deep-seated biases that everyone, from law enforcement to society at large, carried with them every day, whether they realized it or not. He thought about the world he wanted to live in, the world where his race didn't define his value, where people didn't make snap judgments based on the color of his skin. He wasn't naive enough to think that writing an article would fix everything overnight, but it was a start. It was a chance to spark a larger conversation, to make people see him, and everyone like him, for who they truly were. I didn't speak out that morning. I kept my cool. I stayed composed. I didn't want to escalate the situation further, and I knew the moment would pass. But in my silence, I realized something profound. Silence was no longer an option. Not for me, not for anyone. The reality is, there are too many others who've experienced the same thing and who've been left to suffer in silence. And if I stay quiet now, if I let this go without saying something, then I'm part of the problem. This is about more than just one interaction with the police. This is about the culture that allows such assumptions to be made in the first place. It's about a system that perpetuates inequality, one that tells people like me that we don't belong, that we aren't worthy of respect, that our lives don't matter. But I'm here to tell you that we do matter. Our lives matter. And I won't be silent anymore. Drake hit send with a sense of finality. His heart was still pounding, and a wave of nervous energy surged through him as he sat back in his chair staring at the screen. He knew this would be just the first step. There would be backlash. There would be people who didn't want to hear his story. But there would also be people who listened, people who felt what he was saying, people who understood. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. He had spoken his truth. Now he just had to trust that others would be willing to hear it. Drake took a deep breath and stood up, walking over to the window once more. The night was settling in, and the world outside was quiet. But inside, everything had shifted. This was just the beginning of a much bigger journey, a journey to not just change the way people saw him, but to help change the way society saw each other. He wasn't just a doctor anymore. He was a man with a purpose, and the road ahead, however long and uncertain, was one he was ready to walk.